Hi, my name is Mike Roberts. I'm a PhD candidate working on the history of steam engines. I mostly study small steam engines in agriculture and in rural areas. People get really excited about big steam engines and mostly only talk about those. Thinking about small steam engines like the ones used on farms has the potential to really revise how we think about industrialization as a process. But today's talk is not about that, it's about research methods. Before I decided to try and be a historian, I did anthropology, contract archaeology in 19th century Ontario. I was an avocational experimental archaeologist, and I worked at a railway museum where I learned to operate steam locomotives. So I came into graduate school with expectations around technical literacy, material culture, and a sort of somatic sense of the past that were a little bit exaggerated. But it meant I also very quickly noticed systematic errors arising because those kinds of knowledge are not standard in history departments. At this conference, I'm preaching to the converted on that part, but I also want to bring some of my historical training back to experimental archaeology as well. The word experimental tends to evoke the lab sciences, but lab techniques aren't always the best techniques. I want to bring in ideas from social sciences and humanities, and specifically in this case, participant observation to sort of fill those gaps. The goal for me is to think about developing the researcher as a tool of research. So the construction of literacies, sensitivities, and attunements. These are the underpinnings of rigor in qualitative rather than quantitative work. Interestingly, the earliest description of participant observation that I'm aware of is from a formal research proposal by William Marshall. He argued that agriculture specifically could only be understood through long-term participant observation because most of the knowledge and skill involved was tacit, because the tasks are interlinked and dependent on unique details like land and weather. In anthropology today, participant observation is iterative, holistic, and flexible. Research questions are allowed to change radically over the course of a project, and allowing the subject matter to direct the process in that way is part of what makes the work rigorous. So things and processes are sometimes excluded entirely from the discipline of history, but they're inevitably there in the past. That means that they have to be as much a part of history as decisions and speeches and writings. I think that to understand textual sources deeply, it's often necessary to have these familiarities. And so with that in mind, I want to sort of trace how experimental work that I don't really get to cite, that's hard to cite in formal ways, has contributed to my work. So instead of calling out some poor historian for not understanding how to belt up a steam engine, I've decided to illustrate the problem by attacking the work of a colonial oppressor because that seems more fair. A. Musto was an agricultural engineer who was asked to suggest how steam agriculture should be applied in India. What he came up with is obviously based on reading knowledge. He avoids all applications which require belt drives because, he says, belting up is almost impossible. But easily 30 years before he wrote that, belting up was daily practice in North America, and I'm going to show you someone who does it in 2 minutes flat. Academic historians consistently make the same error today for slightly different reasons. The major problem is probably just how common a maneuver this really is. It's not just tools that become extensions of your hands over time. Tasks also become extensions of each other. They get grouped. And that can have this sort of paradoxical effect on text sources, where the folks who are doing the most of something record their work in the tersest ways. When academic historians assume there's no belting up happening, typically it's not because they think it's hard. It's because they don't realize it's even a thing. They haven't encountered it. They aren't seeing what's not written. For example, in the farm log of Beulah Tallman, the process of belting up is never mentioned at all. It's implicit in notes like John goes over to James Durham's to saw and cut feed. But it's not written clearly. And this happens all through the primary sources. Notes on engine setup are like these proverbial shots to the wingtips. They don't tend to tell the real story. It's what's missing that does that. And those absences quickly become obvious when you try and run an engine, or even much of the time when you just watch someone. So on the left, you see Steam Era, which is a public history presentation in Ontario. I took this photo about a minute after I utterly failed to belt up this engine, and moments after Frank Hume, who owns the engine, sort of stepped in and made it look easy. So the goal is to get this drive belt tensioned between the motive power source, in other words, the steam engine, and the actual tool. In this case, that's the thresher in the background. These are two completely separate machines. And that's one of the things that gets overlooked in a lot of historical work, but it's very obvious on the ground. So in the note from the logbook, John goes to saw and cut feed. We know he belted up twice because the saw and the chopping machine are two separate pieces of equipment, and they both need steam power. Okay, these two wheels, so they need to be lined up precisely parallel. If they're not, the belt will work its way off. If the belt falls off in the wrong way, it can be damaged by the gears, and these are actually fairly expensive, as you can see from the ad. If the belt is too tight or too loose, it's hard on the equipment, as the pocket guide here describes. But neither the ad or the pocket guide says anything about doing this several times a day, and the pocket guide really makes it sound like it's a one-off. So I won't show you my disaster. Instead, I'll show you Frank doing this in competition earlier in the day.
Just to give you an idea, the bonus points, if you finish first at the end of the match, you get an extra 20 points. Everybody do. You get it all right. It's all good. 50 points on top. Belting, 9 times out of 10, I gotta tell you, you're yourself what's happening. First is natural perfect, but if you do that, okay, Team Red, they're going to be the first ones to get that belt. You see how high that was? Now comes the hard part. Backing up, try and get it perfectly. If they don't, the belt will come flying off with another ejection. Once they get that straight, once they're happy with what they consider a good hookup, they call the engineers for like to start now. See if that belt will stay on. Hopefully it will.
As you can see, he makes that look very easy, but he can't really explain how. This is tacit knowledge in operation. We can also read more processes from these notes. So John owns the steam engine and the peripheral tools. When Beulah says he goes to James Durham's, we know that he's going with at least 2 teams of horses, implying either his son or a farmhand drove with him, which says something about the size of the crew and the presence of horsepower. Steam engines don't replace horsepower. You can get that from statistics, but it's a much harder argument than just pointing. We can also infer like a whole substantial sequence of processes needed to prepare the equipment and the teams for the journey. This family also raises these horses. And again, from basic experimental work, we know those horses need to be extremely well trained to be able to stay calm around these objects. So what we really have is this multi-year history of household activity tacitly implied in tiny scraps of writing like this. And this stuff can drive bigger history as well. Engine design, for example. Historically, farm engineers largely rejected the modifications that would have made belting up easier. Those modifications increase the number of parts that can break down. So this probably reflects that skills can be improved, Frank versus me, but maintenance tasks continue to take time and cannot be practiced away. As you hear, I'm beginning to edge into parts of the story that require a much more intensive level of technical literacy to make legible. So let's dive into the far end of that spectrum and look at some of my work in process. At the very beginning of these logbooks, Beulah Tallman's logbooks in 1890, her husband John Tallman buys a new engine and he tries to sell this Champion. Seems like he can't find a buyer, and a few months later they may seem to be enlarging his metal shop and also other aspects of their operation. Interestingly, including things like Beulah Tallman gets a new clothes washing machine, and her dairy seems to be getting bigger. So we might be crossing gender lines that historians tend to take for granted in industrial labor structures. If she's running her dairy off his old engine, the answer is obvious to them. absolutely obvious. But from the perspective of a historian, it's kind of a problem. They don't say it. Now, there's a few ways to get at this, and some of them are traditional historical approaches, like looking at their oil consumption to see if they're using enough to be running a kerosene engine. They're not. Another approach is to look at the maintenance records to try and understand if John is doing maintenance on both steam engines. This requires pretty intimate familiarity with boiler maintenance and with the types of engines on the market in 1890. John replaces 27 tubes in his new engine during an emergency shutdown, all at one time, and a few more during downtime over the next week or so. This gives us an indication that the new engine is most likely to be a return flue type engine like the one in this image. The tubes being worked on here are fairly accessible, which makes it logistically possible to work on them in a piecemeal way, the way John does at the end of that first experience. The Champion engine, on the other hand, would have needed to have all 99 tubes replaced in one shot, and it would be even harder than you see in the image top right here. This is also the last time that we see Tallman attempt to replace about 30 tubes at the same time. It seems like he makes a change in his maintenance strategy to suit the new engine at this point. That said, he does sometimes change large numbers of tubes at once, every few years, and it seems to be a much larger number in total that could possibly be needed for an engine like this. This may be an indication that the older engine, which used 99 very short tubes, was still taking on new wear. A third approach might be to look at engine movements and crew. At one point, even though there seems to be an engine at the lime kiln most of the time, they're moving an engine in and out of that location, and they need extra horses. This is unusual. It's noted as unusual in the log, and the roads are noted as being good around the same time. So the extra horsepower seems to be about a heavier engine rather than about mud or something like that. They do 2 jobs simultaneously with 4 engineers. Now, you can run 2 jobs with one engine. Belt drives can do that, but it is very complicated. And the 2 sets of engineers suggest that they're not. It suggests that they're running 2 engines almost side by side at the same time. I could add more stuff, all of which is still going to be circumstantial at this point. Well, we've clearly not ruled out a 2-engine farm just yet, and I think things are building towards a preponderance of evidence for 2 engines. At this point, the next step is to move on to a quantitative approach, which is a little bit outside the scope of this paper, and I'll see if I can make a definite claim of 2 engines. If Tallman's first engine was retired to a more stationary existence, that's one clear example of a key hypothesis I've been trying to investigate. The idea that this is something that might be happening to older engines itself came up in the course of experiential work. So both the question and the answers rely on these technical literacies gained through experience. And in fact, finding the logbooks also required this kind of deeper technical literacy. How do I know they could have been missed? Well, it's a substantial set of fonts, and they've been missed in this context at least once before. So my work in this very broad sense has depended on and will continue to depend not only on specific experiences like belting up or retubing Frank's engine, but on things like Frank's previous experience, which I benefit from every time I work with him, as well as the help and expertise of Michael Guy, Wayne Fisher, Irvine, dozens of other experiential historians in the Ontario Steam Heritage community. And within that community, there are different kinds of experience. Some of these folks have operated engines in regular service, like Dave Powell and Jeff Searson. And then at almost the polar opposite, my main mentor, Michael Guy's focus is on models and miniature, which allow for kinds of work that you really cannot do with full-scale equipment. There are things that you just can't get the resource together to reproduce. At its roots, I think that these technical literacies, like language literacy, rely on interactions that are not actually goal-directed at all, but usually can only be described as play. This is a type of work that happens in community, in discussion, and in the physical world. It absolutely requires the sort of expansive, iterative methodologies of participant observation and the forms of rigor that have been developed in the social science and the humanities for qualitative work. Quantitative study does come into it, but there is a real role and importance to the qualitative, rigorous qualitative work. And it takes time, and it takes expertise. And all of these experts that I've relied on who've been spending years on this work don't have academic credentials or published papers. So I'd like to end on a question, which is really the motivation for this paper, which is what are some good ways, better ways, ways that you've used to present this kind of information to a broader audience, including people who might be skeptical of the value of experimental archaeology? And on that note, thank you for listening.